All right, so we're finishing up with George Orwell's Animal Farm, which is the perfect book to be discussing at this particular moment in history. Walter, why is this the perfect book to be discussing right now?
Well, because in Animal Farm, the story of the animal takeover of a human farm, let's remember, the animals representing the working class, and the leaders of the animals representing various Soviet leaders, Stalin, Trotsky, and so on. Uh, we see the entire course of a revolutionary movement in 100 pages, or I don't know how long the book is. It depends.
It's very short.
Yeah, various editions, 100 pages or less. And in this full cycle portrait, written in 1943, we see the animals go from incredible enthusiasm, from a bitter battle against the humans, which they prevail in, to the owners of their own their own agricultural enterprise. They have certain problems. I'm just reprising. One of them is that they have difficulty building a windmill. It falls apart. They have difficulty getting the tools they need, keeping the keeping the harvest going in the way they need to. But finally, their ultimate difficulty is with their own natures. And a certain group of people, the pigs, who consider themselves in a way the natural leadership, in the same way I think that Mamdani and Mehdi and Hassan consider themselves to be a kind of natural leader class. They were certainly acting like the pigs in that bro moment where they're all, grabbing each other and laughing.
Legs, yeah.
I mean, that was Animal Farm par excellence, And so what happens is that this elite, this vanguard, this leadership group slowly starts giving itself a little more latitude and a few more privileges and a few more cocktails, as it were, than the rest of the group, whose labor they depend on. And then as they fail more, they start revising their platform to reflect fewer promises and more flexible principles, because having violated the principles and failed to live up to the promises, they sort of have to revise them backward. And then they start revising history itself to make themselves look good and make past victims of their rule or leaders of factions that have been cast out look worse. And in the end, the sort of bulwark of this revolution, which has been a horse named Boxer, who has kind of kept things going, rain or shine, just the sheer muscle, representing the kind of inertia and the working class and the endless optimism in a way. There's a donkey in the story, or a mule, who's Benjamin, who's very much like me in some ways. That's who I'd be in Animal Farm. Like, this shit again.
Right.
The more things change, the more they stay the same, and so on. Dour, some would say cynical, fatalist. But in any case, by the end of Animal Farm, what's happened is the leadership of the farm has basically had to ally with humans who they formerly demonized. It's had to fake its own history. It's had to rewrite the story of its leadership, and that leadership, sort of like Governor Newsom at the French Laundry, ends up retreating to its own
drunkenness.
What's that?
To drunkenness, among other things.
Right, to drunkenness and feasting with the humans, who were, if there was one principle of Animal Farm, it was the sheep's constant refrain: 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. Well, in other words, there to be no mixing between the class. the two legs would be the billionaire class in our current scheme. And when at the end of the book, the animals look in the window of the farmhouse, which the pigs have taken over, sort of like Gracie Mansion, the mayor's home in New York City, and they can't tell the difference between their pig leadership and the billionaire
Yes.
human
Yeah.
guests. They're all walking on two legs, and that's one of the great moments in the story for me, sort of cinematically and symbolically, is to watch the pigs trying to balance on their back legs, and they're all sort of wearing fancy dress, and but I don't think that in our current world, Zoran would have any problem walking on two legs. In fact, I think he's always walked
Already
on two.
on two
He's
legs,
always walked on two legs, and he's pretended to walk on four.
right.
And
And that's what that knuckle speech was about, frankly. Right.
right, exactly.
The skull knuckle.
Yeah, his attempt to make himself seem like a four-legged creature. And if the end of Animal Farm suggests that your leadership class is going to end up consorting with the enemy and becoming indistinguishable, it also, I think, optimistically assumes that your leadership class actually were animals at some point, where not humans who dressed up as animals and led the revolution and then threw off their costume and walk naturally. That's what the situation I think we're in.
Right. Yeah. They have a much easier time making the transition. Remember, there was that moment in the Metamorphosis where it went the other way, where Gregor is trying to walk on two legs and he realizes he's a beetle and he can't, he's wobbling and he has to go down to six.
Right.
And eventually that becomes natural. With the pigs, there's no, they don't have any difficulty walking on two legs. One of the things you think about, and it's such an obvious observation, but I didn't think about it until about halfway through the book. It's called Animal Farm, but this is a story very explicitly about human nature, right? And
Right.
For Orwell, who, I think to the end was a believer in a form of democratic socialism. He apparently considered both this book and 1984 failures.
Really? What do you mean?
So I read an essay by Chris Hitchens, of all people, about this, and he was talking about how Orwell, he died at 46. He barely made it to 1950. He had kind of a tragic life. He died sick and broke. He was born with tremendous guilt about the colonial system, right? Because I think his father was in some way involved in the opium trade overseas, and he had been a colonial policeman at one point. His first novel was about that, right? Or his first short story.
Right.
And so he was throughout his life, he was racked by guilt and
tuberculosis. Guilt and tuberculosis.
But his inclination was always that he wanted socialism to work out. He wanted that system to be there. He fought against it. He took a bullet in the neck in the Spanish Civil War. So he truly believed in this, but when he sat down to write, he could not get around. He was too honest of a writer to leave out what happens to human beings, in this kind of situation. And there's a passage at the end that I thought about as I watched these people this week have these almost conscious memory lapses, right? the animals are standing around. Truth be told, a truth to tell, Jones and all he stood for had almost faded out of their memories. They knew that life nowadays was harsh and bare, that they were often hungry and often cold, and that they were usually working when they were not asleep. But doubtless it had been worse in the old days. They were glad to believe so. Besides, in those days they had been slaves and now they were free, and that made all the difference, as Squealer did not fail to point out. And so, this is a thing that Orwell is speaking to, something that's just inherent in human beings, which is that the inability to let a dream die. Once you've been captivated by something, there becomes a sunk cost element in
yes,
in parting with it. Like once you spent your whole life literally breaking your back or your hooves or whatever it is, and giving everything to this movement, it becomes almost impossible psychologically to part with it. And that's what happens on the farm, despite the abundant evidence that they've become they're the same slaves that they always were. In fact, they're worse off than they ever were before. They're just slaves to other animals now, as opposed to being slaves to human beings. They still retreat into this escapism in their own mind, and that's why this is allowed to perpetuate. I think my guess is that for Orwell to write this, it had to be extremely painful to him, because he wrote this during a time when he was physically fighting against fascism, right?
There's a very moving passage toward the end, and maybe you can find it because my Kindle is acting up, in which a few years pass, okay? And Orwell says something like, the years went by and the animals lived and died their short animal lives.
Mm-hmm.
And it's after this passage that they kind of forget. They don't remember the original revolution at Manor Farm. They don't remember anything about the leaderships. And it's after this point that they can be told anything. In other words, they're told that Snowflake, or what's his name, Snowball or Snowflake? I forget now.
Snowball. Yep.
Snowball. Yeah, Snowflake. It's because I keep getting called as Snowflake. They forget the role that he played. They forget the battles that were fought. They forget the origins of the revolution itself, and they can be told anything. And
yep. I found it. But,
yeah, and strangely, I think that's the state that I see the Hassan Victory Party in. You can kind of be told anything about the past, the Soviet Union, whatever, America, its sins, that weird credulous stage that happens after the original group dies out. And the ending is only possible because of that. And when they look and they see the people walking on two legs, or they see the pigs walking on two legs, it's not so much that they're disillusioned, they're just very confused, because they don't have anything to compare it to. The slogans have changed so many times. The stories and the histories have been revised so many times, and you feel sorry for them at the end. They don't seem to be masters of their own destiny. They can't escape this failure that they're part of, and they don't really have the grasp of what else might be possible. And it leaves you with a very empty feeling, the end of Animal Farm.
Yeah. So this is the passage. They were fine, upstanding beasts, willing workers and good comrades, but very stupid. None of them proved able to learn the alphabet beyond the letter B. They accepted everything they were told about the rebellion and the principles of animalism, especially from Clover, from whom they had an almost filial respect, but it was doubtful whether they understood very much of it. Um, this is, I think this is something that was true of late stage Soviet history and probably in a lot of other socialist countries, right? There's a weariness that sets in, and the impossibility of opposing the system. Uh, it's so overwhelming to people that whole areas of thought get shut off. But what does that have to do with modern day America? That's what's so weird about this phenomenon to me, which is that I guess what's happened is in our post NAFTA stage of history, we had that mutual friend who talked about how being in media was just managing the decline. I think there was a similar kind of pessimism about America's future that set in among people, born after a certain date, for some good reasons, right? They didn't see themselves being able to start a family, have a job. This whole idea of dignity is probably pretty resonant with some of those folks because there's not a whole lot of dignity in sharing in a cramped apartment with 5 people, and so you get exhausted after a while, and just like the Trump voters who,
right,
I think reached a point where they could not be lied to even one more time, right, and they finally said, I'll take anything. Except
well,
this.
I mean, but it wasn't just anything. I will take my plants reopening. I will take a tariff policy that protects American industry so that, I can have a job in the future. I mean, I know some of these administration people, and I can tell you they would love nothing more than to have an accommodation or a reunion with the American Union movement in the swing states for political expediency or whatever reason. You can make it as cynical an explanation as you want, but they wanted to reindustrialize America. They want to onshore and reshore, as it were, all sorts of jobs. They want to correct what they see as the excesses of globalism and the harms that it's caused. And it's a pretty harsh and radical critique of what happened. That's what I find so strange about the Mamdani people. Like, you think that you're going to bring back union jobs and, and raise wages and so on, but you're not making the connection to NAFTA. You're not making the connection to any of that. What's going on?
And I think that's a great place. For me, that's ultimately what this whole thing is about. The big split between what happened on the right and what's happening on the left. The Trumpian, the MAGA explanation is we all got screwed under NAFTA. After NAFTA, this globalist economy, when we were deindustrialized and all the jobs went away, and that sucked, and we're going to fix it, and we're going to try to rebuild the country. The Mamdani explanation is, again, it's so cardinally different from the Bernie Sanders prescription. On the surface, it sounds similar, but underneath it all, what the end goal is really is borderlessness, leaning into the globalist movement, accelerating the change to a point where you have a true global economy, but it's globally socialist, and everyone is uplifted that way. I think that's the long-term plan. Whereas, the Bernie plan is more like socialism in one country, right? Like that was the thing that they settled on after a time in the 20s. But it was explicitly to rebuild the United States and bring jobs back to the United States. You don't hear that kind of language with Mamdani, and that's why I think of it as the more suspicious and dangerous of the two models.
Well, one thing that I think is also very Animal Farm about what we're seeing is that in the end, what really defeats the animals is that they decide to change language rather than reality. They don't do a terrible job of getting their farm on a functioning basis. And remember, at the time that Orwell was writing, Stalinism, for whatever its crimes might have been and whatever its hypocrisy might have been, and had just come through a withering battle with Nazi Germany, and had stood up in some very stubborn, brutal, and bloody way to an onslaught. It had an accomplishment in that it had survived. And as I said when we first started discussing this, this was pointed out to Orwell. And they said, Stalin was a big bastard, but he stayed with his people and he fought. That it was tough. In other words, the one thing that Orwell couldn't finally gainsay was how tough this revolution had proved to be. Brutal, but tough. I don't see that among the cohort that I'm looking at right now. I don't see what they've survived. I don't see the famines that they came through, or the mass unemployment, or the things that forged the old revolution and made it, and a lot of that had to do with nationalism too, because no matter who you were, if you were New Soviet man or not, you were still Russian when the Germans came across the plains.
Oh, of course. No,
There's
a reason why they call it the Great. It's basically the Great Patriotic War.
Yes,
it's fatherland, right? They don't talk about the Great Socialist War or anything like that.
Right. And I don't know, without that patriotism, they could have held out in the greatest and bloodiest land struggle of maybe all time. Which was the assault on Russia by Hitler's armies, and that they are trying to destroy any sense of patriotic or homeland fervor or loyalty in America. That freaks me out. Even the animals on Animal Farm, in other words, they're sold out by their leaders, but they love their farm.
Yeah. No. This is essentially painting the United States as the human-run, the Jones farm, and they want to make Animal Farm, right? And I don't love that.
Is self-hatred of the homeland something that comes with socialism? Not necessarily. The two biggest variants of socialism in the 20th century were both, in some sense, nationalist. Russian and German. This is a whole new beast, though. This notion that we're living in a kind of a cloud castle or something.
That's why this whole thing is so strange, because no other society that's or empire that's been as wealthy and as powerful as the United States has ever devoted so much energy to educating its future leaders to dismantle itself.
And sort of be embarrassed of the ground on which they stand.
Right, exactly. It's a strange thing. You mentioned the toughness of the Soviet leaders. That was something that I think they acquired. The revolutionary leaders, most of the the intellectuals who
A
led
little
the
pampered.
yeah, they were pampered, and most of them were wiped out by the time
Right.
the Germans arrived. But Stalin and the Russians they showed extraordinary toughness. There's no question about that. But the pigs that are described in Animal Farm, they one of the things that and this is the sort of the finishing thought for me, the history of those types of intellectuals is that they believed that because the working class lacked the consciousness that was necessary, that it was necessary to deceive them a little bit, right? To promise them certain things and then bring them along later, like they would agree to it later, and that there was a certain level of duplicitousness that was to be encouraged and even admired in a revolutionary leader. And we see this in Animal Farm that the pigs are just effortless liars, right?
Right.
And at the end of the book, they almost go into a frenzy of where they finally unmask their actual thoughts about things. And we get 4 legs good, 2 legs better, right? Which is the exact opposite of what the original slogan was. And then there's this famous passage. For once, Benjamin consented to break his rule, and he read out to her what was written on the wall. There was nothing there now except a single commandment. It ran, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." And so that even in the end, even equality, which was this leveling concept that was, not just a Marxist idea, but it was embedded in British history as well, right?
Sure.
Even that's perverted completely into its opposite by the end of the book, and that's another thing I worry about with. We'll see, right? But I do think that a lot of this iteration of politician, the Mamdani style politician, that they believe in that idea of presenting one face to in certain situations, and we only talk about issues when issues are popular. We talk about those. When issues are less popular, we'll leave those for later, right?
Matt, we've now had exactly 1 year since the Trump election, and we just had this election. Remember back in the summer of the Trump campaign when people at the New York Times were telling you that cost of living concerns were a figment of your imagination. And all of a sudden we're told that cost of living concerns should be the very center of a campaign. That's a full turn of the wheel from whether it was Friedman or whoever it was saying,
Krugman or something like that.
Inflation was in your head, and Trump was somehow screwing with you hypnotically by making you think that there were high prices happening. To all of a sudden, this new populist leftism, which is Trump hasn't brought prices down.
Right.
Everything's too expensive. The rent is too damn high.
Yep.
What? That was a dream a year ago, and now it's the fundamental, essential reality of political life. You can do anything if you can be that flexible.
Yeah. Well, in the end, this book ultimately is a warning, right?
Right. Yes.
It's a warning about profits and about rebellion, leaders of rebellions, and leaders of movements, and political promises, and the flexibility of reality,
right?
When hardcore politics is involved, and it's a view. One of the things that Orwell wrote is that people need to have a fundamental suspicion of power, and that's not just true of capitalist power; it's true of all power. And so I hope that people who do read this book, if they're reading it for the first time, understand what he was trying to talk about. Because you could even apply it to the Trump phenomenon, the MAGA phenomenon, if you wanted to. The problem is that it doesn't fit quite so perfectly. When Trump got up there and he said, "There's going to be so much winning, people, you won't know what to do with yourself."
Right.
People didn't really take that literally, right? Like they knew he was a little bit full of shit when he said it. This is different. There's real belief here, and when you mess with real belief, I worry about the consequences. But anyway, I think this is the perfect book to read.
Yeah, it is. But my strange point that I didn't go into today's broadcast having in mind, but do now, is that after having them talk about wishing the Soviet Union had won and how awful America is, and that you're either at the core or in the heart of the horror of imperialism or whatever it might be, I reflect that the animals did have one thing over on this group, which was that they loved their farm. And I don't know that you even get Animal Farm, you even get to that point without loving your farm. And the big difference here is that this is an intellectual revolution led by, I think, people who are pretending to be animals who don't love the farm. And in that case, it's even scarier than Animal Farm. And one last thing. What Animal Farm lacks that 1984 has is Winston Smith. It lacks a character who still remembers the truth, who still remembers the facts, and will not be dominated. On Animal Farm is more tragic because the animals, in a way, they're too, as Orwell said, too stupid to understand what's happening to them. Their lives are too short, too hard, and they're not literate in many cases. And it's too brutal for them to really understand the con that's been run on them. And in that way, it's a book that makes me sadder. 1984 is terrifying, but Animal Farm is sad because finally it's a story of a group of creatures that had a fundamental and I think rather just complaint that they were being terribly exploited and used. And they did their best to right it. They were betrayed by their own leaders, and they were too stupid to understand they were being betrayed. It's a very...
Well, they were also made stupid, though, by stress and anxiety and physical labor and the conditions and all that.
And endless deception, which demoralizes you. The one of the most poignant moments in the book is when Boxer is, starts to realize that despite being literal workhorse of the revolution and of the farm, his leadership, he thinks, has lied to him. And he has to make a choice. Do I turn against do I turn against the leadership that's driving me, or do I just work harder as his main slogan? And he decides to work harder and also add the principle of my leadership is always right, no matter what. And that's actually the tragic turn in Animal Farm when Boxer decides to lie to himself.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And that was probably the tragic turn in Soviet history too, right? When they the war was important in galvanizing the ordinary Russian behind the experiment, but and Stalin's death too, but they had a similar moment there. The last thing I'll say is just while these animals are ground down by all the labor they're forced into and the passage of time, young Americans have been put through a lot. They have had a lot of economic stress, and they've had anxiety. They've had
Yes.
anxiety intentionally foisted upon them in enormous amounts. We think about what happened in COVID, but also, a couple of weeks ago, I read this paper from people at Harvard talking about climate change anxiety and how it wasn't a bad thing. Like other kinds of anxiety is pathological and needs to be fixed, but this was adaptive anxiety. This was helpful because it's motivating people to change.
Right.
And so we've been pumping people full of anxieties that somebody up there thinks are adaptive, but there is no such thing as adaptive anxiety. And anxiety is crippling and clouds your judgment and makes you makes it harder for you to act in your own behalf. And
it makes you susceptible to any message which promises to relieve you of the anxiety or channel it into action.
Exactly. And that I think is the one thing. That's a close parallel with this book and the current reality is that the animals were ground down. They were psyched to do this at the beginning, but at the end they went along just because their will had been sapped. And there's a lot of that with modern voters, and we've seen it on both sides. So,
yeah. Good point.
Anyway, great book. It's too bad we can't do like 10 of these. These are amazing books to read. But it's been a pleasure to read it with you, Walter. And I hope you all have you're in Utah right now, right?
Salt Lake City, Utah. Yeah, where I imagine a lot of financial types and corporate types are going to be relocating soon. They already started. You've got a Goldman Sachs second office, but New York's loss may be Utah's gain. But I want to say finally, the conditions that have caused this political shift, at least in New York City, are real conditions, and the addressing of them will determine our future. And so we're in a new phase in the sense that I think both sides agree that the issues are economic now.
Yep, and we'll just have to see how it turns out.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's been great, and we'll see you all next week.